Yes.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. So good to see all of you. We're going to be having just an informational interim hearing, joint hearing between the Education Finance Committee and the Property Tax Division. So welcome to Chair Drazkowski, and thank you for suggesting this to us. I think it's a great topic. We are going to do just an overview because whether you serve on either committee, it can be a little bit of a complicated subject to start thinking about the two different types of property tax wealth calculations that are done and how they're applied differently to school finance, whether it's a bond issue or a levy issue, and how that works. And so, so we're going to have our nonpartisan staff experts, Mr. Strom and Mr. Hines, do some overviews for the committee, so we can all kind of get up to speed and refresh ourselves on that. I will say, you know, we'll try to do this somewhat informally, so if you have a question along the way, just raise your hand, and nonpartisan staff members, are you all right if we just interrupt you periodically with questions? Okay. And then after that, Representative Drazkowski and Representative Marquardt are going to present an idea that they've been working on for some reforms in this area. So with that, Representative Drazkowski, Chair Drazkowski, any comments you wanted to make?
Thank you, Chair Loon. No, not really a lot, but just thank everybody for coming. This is, I think we, as we look at the bill that Representative Marquardt and I are going to be presenting later, we kind of would like this, and Chair Loon and I have talked about it, to be kind of a familiarization tour, not only with the bill, but also the background behind it. So the bulk of the time is going to be Mr. Strom and Mr. Hines kind of going through those first items on the agenda. And then we'll get into the bill, which Representative Marquardt and I have been working on for the last 2 years, and I've been working on this idea for about 4 years. But it's certainly not done yet, and I think we would like your input on how we can make it better going forward, and hope that we can actually adopt something in this area. So, thank you, Chair Loon.
All right, thank you, Chair Drazkowski. If there are no other comments, and I would just let the committee members know we do have to stop at noon. We're a little rusty on session for an hour and a half, and then realize during session we're an hour and 45 minutes, but we'll cover everything we can in an hour and a half, and we'll be here until noon. So if we have the opportunity for public testimony with the time we have, we'll allow it, but we may not. And again, this is, you know, we're not moving anything today. It's just informational. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So again, welcome Mr. Strom and Mr. Hines. And again, if you, just for our record, introduce yourselves into the microphone. And whoever wants to lead off, please proceed.
Madam Chair, members, thank you very much. My name's Tim Strom. I'm with House Research in the Education Finance area, and I'm joined today by Steve Hines, our property tax expert in House Research. We've got a couple of big subject areas we want to touch on, and they're rather interrelated. So we've still been struggling a bit with what the most effective way to present the order of this material is for you. But I think what we'll do is I'll start with a few comments about school districts, school district levies, and the process of equalization. We'll move from there to a quick discussion of the new school building bond ag credit that passed last session. And then Mr. Hines will get into a discussion about tax base. The school taxes are really a two-part question. There's what goes into making the property tax levy calculation, and then there's the effect of that. Who's paying for that? How is that spread on the tax base that we've got in Minnesota? And then we'll talk about agricultural lands and the valuation for just a little bit, and then we'll move into Representative Drazkowski and Marquardt's bill. So with that, if you'd start with the single sheet that's a table with that says school district levies pay 18 by category. That may give you some sense of the relative proportion of the things we're talking about. What this sheet does on the very top line, you can see that there's $2.8 billion, $2.88 billion of school levies that were just certified by the 331 school districts, or 330 school districts this past fall. Those are called payable 2018 levies because the taxpayers pay those levies during calendar year 2018, and then the school districts will use that money in the 2018-2019 school year. So you can see at the very top line on this, the total certified levy, all funds, is $2.88 billion. And of this amount, about a little less than 40%, $1.1 billion, is on referendum market value. Those are just the four levy categories, the four levies that you can see on the right there with referendum market value by them. And the remainder, about $1.7 billion, is calculated and spread on the adjusted and net tax capacity tax basis. So what this document tries to show you is how the categories on one page for those $2.88 billion of levy. The first category shows the total amount of levy. The next shows the number of school districts that are levying in each of those categories. The second to last column is saying equalize. That's really, is there a state aid component attached to this? Is there an equalization aid formula attached to this? And then that last category is the tax base that's used to calculate and spread the levy. And Mr. Hines will be talking more about tax base in a few minutes. If you look at these are sorted by fund. If you look at the general fund, you can see the top two on the list, $698 million for the operating referendum and $321 million for the local optional revenue. These two amounts are basically the two main levies that are on referendum market value. The referendum is primarily voter approved now. The local optional revenue is at the option of the school board. But about $1 billion there, a little more than $1 billion, is on the in those two categories of levy, and those are on our current definition of referendum market value. The levy that's primarily being changed in this bill proposal, if you go down to the debt service fund, you can see that there's a total of $918 million in the debt service fund, and that amount is all on net tax capacity, and that's primarily the fund that's the levy categories that are going to be changed by House File 2495. The debt service fund consists of the basic debt levy that's voter approved, the long-term facilities debt, which is school board approved. There's a share of the debt service fund that's aid ineligible, a very small share for the two districts that are in the disaster category for debt service levies. But essentially what's happening under the bill is these debt service levies are going to be equalized on a tax base much similar to the operating referendum and less similar to the net tax capacity tax base that they're currently on. So those, as an explanation then of those two categories, it's probably helpful to look at the single sheet that says school district referendum elections. And it's on both sides, but a single sheet that's taken from the school finance guidebook and then slimmed down a little bit for today's discussion. And just to make a couple of points, the Finance Committee members are probably familiar with this, so it may be more helpful for those on the Property Tax Division, but on the operating referendum revenue, that's additional authority that's available to school districts if they go to the voters. And the voters can approve up to not quite $2,000 per pupil now of additional authority that's an equalized aid and levy if their voters vote yes on that amount. There's a small portion of that, about $300 per pupil, can be approved by board action, but essentially a school district can go to the voters and say, hey, we'd like you to give us some additional operating money. And you can see here on the little table that says referendum revenue amounts for the coming school year, which most of the documents you've got in front of you are designed to match. The referendum levy is about $673 million, but the equalization aid is also pretty substantial at about $144 million. So the state is paying aid on those voter-approved referendum amounts for the lower valued districts. That aid is about, as I said, about $145 million, and a much more significant part than when we look at the debt service levy. The referendum market value is calculated and spread on the tax base we call referendum market value. Mr. Hines is going to talk about that in a minute, but essentially the key points to keep in mind when you're thinking about these two tax bases is referendum market value excludes seasonal rec, the cabin property, and it excludes ag lands, and additionally there are no class rates essentially between the other classes of property, so that property like a home or property like a business essentially pay the same based on their estimated market value. The debt service levy, which is the one that's primarily being changed by the bill, is somewhat similar. School districts go to the voters to ask for approval to sell bonds. And if those bond sales are approved, then the school district sells the bonds, pays the contractor off with the bonds, and then makes a series of annual repayments called a debt service levy for each of the next years, often for a 20-year period, to repay the amount that they borrowed with the bonds. The equalization formula for debt service is calculated on net tax capacity, not on referendum market value, and the relative amount of aid is quite a bit smaller. If you turn to the second side of that page, you can see that the debt service equalization aid is only about $22 million. Contrast that with about the $145 million of operating referendum. And the debt service levy is a little bigger as well, about $905 million once all those categories of debt levy are added together. So the debt service equalization aid program calculated on net tax capacity, equalized in a way that provides significantly less state aid than the operating referendum program. The third piece of information I'd like to talk about for just a minute, if you go back to that levy page, the number we refer to at the top is called the total certified levy, all funds. That's the levy amount before credits are applied. And Mr. Hines will talk a little more about credits as well. But last year, the legislature enacted the school building bond ag credit, and there's about a 12-page printout in your packet oriented on the 8.5 by 11 paper-oriented landscape style that shows the impact of that ag credit in its first year. And what the credit's doing is it's taking that school levy, that certified school levy, and reducing it by an additional amount. The state then is making the taxing jurisdiction, the school district, whole by paying an aid of the amount that's credited. So if you look for just a minute at this printout, in that very first category, you'll see a slightly different definition of debt service levies used, but about $919 million of school levy are subject to the ag credit, the school building bond ag credit. In the third column, you can see that the agricultural lands are paying about $91 million of that total. About 10% of the total debt service levy is paid by ag lands under current law. The credit is 40% of that amount, according to the credit that you enacted last year. So about $37 million, $36.6 million of that is paid for by the credit. Not surprisingly, the distribution of that credit is very heavily geared toward districts in greater Minnesota because that's where the ag land is at. So you can see that for the metro districts, about $3 million of that credit applies, and in the non-metro districts and the other school districts that are located in greater Minnesota, those 270 districts or thereabouts, the ag land is paying about $33 million out of the total debt service levy in those districts.
All right, and Mr. Strom, we do have a question, so if you
Yes.
suspend Representative Anderson.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Mr. Strom, going back to your explanation of debt service revenue and the relative lesser amount of equalization, in a rural district, what happens to that equalization as the value of farmland increases? Could you go over that?
Mr. Strom.
Yes, Madam Chair, Representative Anderson, I should have probably spent a moment or two more on the way that most school formulas are equalized, and that is that the magic number, as it were, is really the school district's tax base per pupil unit. And so as tax base grows, if pupil units stay the same, the relative value of the district increases. And that's the measure that the equalization is based on. And you'll see some charts from Mr. Hines in a little bit here. You'll see the very rapid increases in ag tax base over the last 10, 15 years. Those have meant that most of those agriculturally based districts are much more property wealthy for purposes of the school funding formula. The equalizing formula sets essentially a tax base level, says so many dollars per pupil is what the state's going to help you out with. And if you're above that in your tax base per pupil, you're not going to get any assistance. And in the debt service equalization program, it's broken into tiers. The first tier, the first 15.74% is all done locally. The second tier is at about $4,400 per pupil, which is well under the state average on the tax base per pupil unit when tax base is measured as net tax capacity. And then once you get into a very significant amount of debt, once you get over about 26% unequalized tax rate on debt, then that amount goes up to $8,000 per pupil. But that still is relative, that even though that's greater than the state average, for many of the smaller rural districts, their tax base per pupil is going to be above that level because the value of that ag land is worth so much. But that magic number for equalization, whether it's on market value or tax capacity, is the tax base divided by the pupil units. That's really the key to determining, for purposes of the school formulas, how much tax, how tax wealthy the school district is, how much tax base per pupil it has, is the number that we key off of.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, just a quick follow-up. So when was the last time that equalization formula was adjusted?
Madam Chair, Representative Anderson, there have not been significant changes for the last 15 years or so with the ag formula. There was, with the exception that a couple of years ago, it was finally linked to the overall growth in tax base. So as the tax base overall grows, all classes of property, it starts tracking with that. Now, that change was a couple of years ago, but those tiers that are in place having to do a tax levy of 15% locally first, that hasn't been changed in probably 15 years. And then that next tier's equalizing factor, that's been at relatively the same level. The third tier's equalizing factor, if memory serves me, was increased a bit, but really those haven't been changed very much. And you can see that on that table showing that only about 20-some million out of the 900 million is equalization aid.
All right. Any other questions right now? All right.
Okay.
Please continue.
And Madam Chair, and let me add just one more caveat about that. The operating referendum, which is on market value, those equalizing factors have been changed pretty substantially in recent years, and that's part of why there's relatively more state aid now in the operating referendum than there is in the debt service levy. Okay, so members, back
I'm
to...
sorry, we have
sure.
another question. Representative Loeffler.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to Mr. Strom, not on the Education Committee, so still catching up. But the strategy of using a debt service revenue, where you sell bonds and then you're paying off over time, versus the capital project referendum, is the capital project referendum, since it's 10 years limited, is that more to rehabilitation, or is it more just a style of financing? Some districts like to build up a kitty and then do the project, and others are more interested in debt.
Mr. Strom.
Madam Chair, Representative Loeffler, you're very perceptive on this for not being on the School Finance Committee. The original reason for that levy was called the down payment levy, and it was exactly that, to be a bridge from one big bond issue to another so that the tax rate in that school district wouldn't fall as much. It was, pardon me, it was originally designed in that manner. School districts started looking at that and saying, hey, that would also work for pardon me, that would also work for technology issues and smaller building projects that we need to do as well. So more of the use in the last 6 or 7 years has been by districts who've got a big technology project that they're working on, or some modifications to a facility that are shorter term in need than what they could do with the bonded debt. But the actual reason it got created was for that whole idea to bridge between two major bond issues so that there wouldn't be a big fluctuation in the tax rate that taxpayers were seeing in the school buildings category.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, good questions. Any others right now? All right, go ahead, Mr. Strom. Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Moran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Strom, I guess my only question and probably major concern would be, does this impact, since funding for school is based on property tax, so there's low-wealth communities, which really impacts, supplies and other things for schools. Does this bill impact that process, the dollars that's coming into urban schools?
Mr. Strom.
Madam Chair, Representative Moran, most of the school funding formulas are designed on a project basis, an amount approved basis, or a per pupil basis or something like that. And most of the formulas, if you look back to that first sheet, if you see the word equalized on that formula, that means that there's going to be some state aid put on that formula based on the district's property wealth. And that's a really good question. The idea from sort of a public policy point of view with an equalized state aid is for the state to help lower property tax based districts have the same relative tax rate for the same types of services, for the same overall amounts of money. So, for example, on the operating referendum, on that first $300 per pupil that the voters can approve, that amount is equalized at a high level, a relatively high level, so that almost all school districts in the state are getting that first $800,000 with the same tax rate. As you move into those subsequent lower tiers, though, it costs those residents of those taxpayers in lower tax-based districts, it starts to cost them more compared to the high tax-based districts in those next two tiers because the equalization is at a lower level. And again, from sort of a neutral point of view, if the goal were to entirely wipe out property tax differences amongst communities, that equalization should be at that high rate so that the tax rate's unchanged. But because it's sort of a stair-step equalization, as you get to that higher level of voter-approved operating referendum amounts, it's going to take more tax effort in a property tax in a community with less property tax base per pupil than it will in a community with more property tax base.
So,
Representative Moran.
So is that a yes?
Mr. Strom.
Madam Chair, you'll see that if you look at the referendum amounts, you'll see that the tax rates will vary fairly substantially. So I don't mean to be coy, but some school districts with lower tax base will make the decision to approve a referendum. It'll cost their taxpayers more, but from a revenue point of view, they'll still be generating that same amount of revenue. And I should mention that these levies, the building levy aside, but the operating referendum is sort of about 10% of the general fund revenue. So most of the general fund money going out through the general education formula is not affected by that property tax base at all. There's small amounts of it that are equalized at relatively high levels, but it's almost all state aid in the general education program. So for that, if you sort of think about it as the basic program, that level is pretty much the same. For the additional amount, the tax rates on the operating referendum, the tax rates are different depending on the community tax base. And in some communities, even with the lower tax base per pupil, the community says we want to pay that higher tax rate in order to generate the same amount of money as a more property wealthy district.
Representative Moran.
Thank you.
All right. We'll proceed. Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, another side to this, if we go back to the school building ag credit for just 1 minute, then, is that some of that value can be in a particular class of property. It might be in commercial industrial property. In the case of the ag credit, maybe in ag property. The addition or the growth rather in that portion of the pie that's ag property is such that even with the substantial tax base, then a school district may have the other problem than a low tax base issue in that they can't pass a referendum because the incidence of that tax is going to be so heavily borne by one type of property or another. And so the theory behind what passed last year with the school building ag credit was to say, well, another way to do this besides changing the definition of tax base would be to provide a credit after the fact and reduce a particular category of a particular class of property taxes paid through the state making a credit payment as opposed to an equalization payment. And you can see here then that the last three columns on this printout show some sample properties, some examples. The first is on farmland valued at $1.8 million. You can see that what the impact of that would have been on a farm, on the farmland of a farm that size without the credit. The second to last column then shows what that would be with the credit. And then the third category shows what that impact would be on a home with a $200,000 home in that community. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the incidence of how that debt service levy is affecting these communities, and also then what the ag credit does for some of those communities.
And Mr. Strom, just a quick question, so I know that I'm reading this chart correctly. As I look down the second category, debt service tax rate, and obviously they vary greatly as you're looking through the school districts. Those with very high, I presume, are districts that have a debt service levy in place, and if they're really high, maybe it's fairly recent that they went out for a bond on a building project?
Madam Chair, yes, there could be two causes for that high tax rate: very low tax base or a relatively high amount of projects approved, and so it can be a mix of those things that can cause that higher tax rate. If you look on the first page there, about halfway down, District 51 is Foley. They're an example of a school district that's had some fairly substantial buildings in the last 35 years, and you can see their tax rate's pretty high. If you look at a few of the metro districts that have large building programs compared to the size of their tax base, like Farmington and St. Michael, you'll also see very high debt service tax rates there as well, with essentially it being a combination of relatively modest tax base per pupil and the large number of approved projects.
Thank you.
We want to mainly stay on track if we can, but one last piece before I turn it over to Mr. Hines. There's a legal sheet in your packet with print that's now too small for me to read, but that shows, it's from the November Price of Government report prepared by Management and Budget. And what's helpful about this is showing the school district revenue over time divided into property tax revenue, into state aid, into federal aid, and then there's a line on here for the credits as well. I don't want to go into that in any detail, but just to give you a very rough sense, if you were to go to the year that we're looking at, the third from last column, fiscal year 19, you can see that total school district revenue is expected to be about $14 billion, and of that amount, about 9.5 is the direct state aid, let's see, oops, I'm sorry. Well, the print's too small. I'm sorry. About 9.5 is the direct state aid, and about the 2.8 billion of the levies, and then there's federal funds and others thrown in there as well. But to give a sense of the importance of that property tax, in Minnesota, the state has a bigger share of paying for schools than in many other states. So that's another way that the state can, in addition to equalizing these levies, is just plain having less of them relative to the total amount spent on schools. We don't, like I say, we don't want to get probably too bogged down in this, but just to give you a sense of the relative magnitude of those. And then if you look at almost that very middle column, which says the homestead agricultural land market value credit, there's two credits run together there, and you can see between fiscal 18 and fiscal 19, that goes from the 8.6 to the 46 million, and that's the result of the addition of the ag credit that's pushing that line up. So with that, Madam Chair, it may make sense to talk about tax base for a little bit.
Mr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and for the records, I'm Steve Hines with the House Research Department. And I think I'd like to start with the sheet that I think was not in your packet, but you would just hand it out, that has the it says 10-year history of agricultural value and taxes on top, or perhaps it was in your packet and it got handed out twice, but people finding that amidst the flurry. And this was just to kind of lay a little groundwork for, I think, for the bill that Representatives Drazkowski and Marquardt are bringing before you today, just to review a little bit about what agricultural values and taxes have been doing recently. So we just took a 10-year look back at the change in market value and in taxes on agricultural property for 10 years. And if you look at the market value changes, you'll see that, you know, in 2 of those last 10 years, there was a growth over 20%. And in 3 of the other years, there were growth in double digits, 10, 11%, 12%. So market values have grown quite rapidly in agricultural property over the last 10 years, and it goes back a little further than that. We just arbitrarily stopped it at 10. Although if you do note now, when you get out into payable 2016, 17, and 18, out at the far right of the chart, you'll see that there actually has been reductions in value each of the last 3 years. So it appears that we've hit a peak and are dropping or leveling off perhaps, and that's been a pattern of agricultural values over, you know, the last 50 years anyway, is that they tend to rise and fall in cyclical patterns, and certainly this recent pattern there has been quite a run-up up until the last couple of years. The net tax, you can see, somewhat follows the growth in values, although there's actually quite a, in many years it doesn't track that closely, because that also depends on what other types of property values are doing and what local governments are doing for levies, what the legislature is doing for aid interventions with aid programs and credit programs, et cetera. But you'll see again the last 2 years now, we're looking at slight drops in agricultural property taxes, and especially in pay 18, that the drop of 4% is a little bit due to the value drop, but also to the new ag credit, the school bond credit that was just passed. The last line, the effective tax rate, is a good measure over time that just sort of looks at what is the tax relative to the value. So that's the overall tax as a percentage of the overall market value, and it rose as high as about 0.6% of market value. This is an average statewide, and it's now dropped back down to about 0.5. So there has been some relief from the real high peaks of ag value recently. With that, then the next thing I was going to go into would be what is on the, there's a three-sheet handout that has pie charts on the front, and I really would like to, that's the first sheet says Greater Minnesota Tax Base Comparison. People find it, so it starts with the front of the page is 2 pie charts, and I'd like to start with page 3 of that of that little handout.
All right, has everybody found them there? You have 2 green packets in your folder, so this is in the other green packet if you're wondering. Like that.
Yes.
All right, go ahead, Mr.
All right.
Hines.
So on page 3 of that is the text part, and this kind of just reviews the major classes of property and what their relative contributions are to the tax base under the 2 tax bases that Mr. Strom was talking about earlier. So the first 3 columns are all related to school debt levies, and that's the, and you see the first column there is the NTC net tax capacity. That's the tax base used for debt levies now. And then the 2 columns to the right are the operating referendum levy, and see the column that says pre-2022. So this is the referendum market value contribution. So under the debt levies, the second column, the RMV equivalent, is kind of trying to put it in terms of relative to 100% rather than to the 1%. But so basically, you can see that for net tax capacity, the first two, the ag homestead land, pays, basically 50% and 100% of value on the net tax capacity side, but on the referendum market value side, they pay 0. And the same with ag non-homestead is 1% or 0. Then you can see the various class rates, and I know the members of the property tax division are pretty well acquainted with those. Commercial industrial 1.5%, 2% on NTC. The homes 0.6 to 1%. That might seem a little confusing to people because the class rate itself is 1%. However, there's an exclusion. Some of the value of your home is excluded from taxation. And if you looked at that as a class rate, that actually reduces it somewhat from the 1%, although it varies by the value of the property, and not many are at 0.6%, but it probably more to think about in terms of 0.8% to 1% or 80 to 100% if you look at the RMV equivalent. And then the last two lines on that form, I would point out to you the seasonal recreational property, the cabins, are at 1%, 1.25% under NTC, but over on the right side, on the referendum market value side, those are at 0%. So as Mr. Strom said earlier, cabins and seasonal recreational property, or cabins and farm land does not pay the referendum market value tax, and then everything else under the market value tax is taxed at the same rate, 100%. There are a few minor exceptions for very minor classes, but by and large, just think of it as $1,000 of value pays that tax no matter what kind of property it is, unless it's ag land or cabins on the recreational market value side. So kind of previewing what House File 2495 is going to be talking about, it's proposing a change in how that referendum market value tax base is defined, as well as which base is used for school debt levies. And so the two columns then that say after 2022, what the referendum market value tax base is, and the proposal would have all debt levies approved after 2022 or after July of 2021 would go against that revised referendum market value tax base rather than the net tax capacity tax base. So the farmlands would go from 50 on net tax capacity, instead of being 50% and 100% would be 0. Commercial industrial property, the first tier would be 150%, would drop to 100%. Commercial industrial property over 150,000, which is currently, 200%, 2% of relative to the NTC, but you could think of it as 200%, drops to 125%. So that's a change in how they're handled under. So the idea under this bill is that both operating referendums and debt levies would switch to this new base in 2022, although only on a going forward basis for new approvals of debt levies. And then if you look at the bottom, the last two lines, you'll see the cabins, which currently for debt levies, they're paying 125%. They dropped to paying 25%, so they're not at the 0% of referendum market values as they are now, but they do make a contribution, are forced to pay 25% under the new scheme. And the two pie charts then kind of highlight.
And Mr. Hines, we actually,
Yes.
Representative Drazkowski has a question, so we'll suspend.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Mr. Hines, if we could just make it clear, I think under the residential homestead property, you say including HGA, so the farm, house, garage, and acres included on that line. So people would ask, what about the farmer and their house and their garage and acre? Are they going from 100% to 0? And the answer is no. Can you help us with that?
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Haynes.
Chair Representative Drazkowski, exactly correct. The house, garage, and 1 acre portion of an ag homestead is taxed as a residential homestead the same way, and would continue to pay as a home does.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Joachim.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hines, I don't mean to jump ahead, but on the debt service levy, and I apologize, I should probably know this, having been on a city council, I know that we work really hard to keep our bond rating at a certain level. And bond ratings are dependent on a lot of solvency and being able to pay them back and stability. How would changing your pie of who's paying and what's there, could that affect a school district's bond rating, or do the schools do bond ratings through the state, or are they independent like cities are?
Mr. Strom.
Madam Chair, Representative Joachim, one thing to keep in mind, the school districts do their own bond ratings, but for general obligation bonds that are issued by school districts, there's a state guarantee program. So even though they are rated individually on the community and rated on a variety of factors, including their tax base and their overall budget condition, because the state has this guarantee program for most school bond issues, they're covered by that as well. So the bondholder's really protected from a non-payment or some other problem that could happen in the school district for sort of a solvency issue. So as a result of that, there's relatively, I don't want to overstate this, but there's less concern on the part of school districts than there are perhaps on other communities or other municipalities, because the state guarantee is there behind their school district bonds.
Thank you. Other questions? All right, Mr. Hines?
Madam Chair, then the pie charts then that were part of the same handout first show Greater Minnesota, because the tax bases really are fairly different for the metro area and Greater Minnesota. We just broke it into two pieces here to show you the overall effect of the overall composition of the tax base, really under the two definitions of net tax capacity and the revised referendum market value that's presented in House File 2495. And so in Greater Minnesota, you can see that under net tax capacity, homesteads constitute 30% of the tax base, but under the revised referendum market value, they would be 57%. So homes would bear, and this is, on average in Greater Minnesota. It will, of course, vary district by district. Commercial industrial property actually ends up paying or constituting about the same percentage, 21% under net tax capacity, 22% under referendum market value. But the main thing, obviously, is the agricultural change. And in these two charts, agricultural now includes the house, garage, and 1 acre, and that's just because traditionally when Department of Revenue has aggregated these properties into just a few types of property, they've always put the house, garage, and 1 acre in with agricultural, so don't be confused by that. But so the 34% that's shown on net tax capacity includes house, garage, and 1 acre, and the 5% that's left on the referendum market value is only the house, garage, and 1 acre portion. So agricultural goes way down in its percentage from 34 to 5, and homesteads pick up most of that change. Seasonal rec goes from 8% to 4% under this plan. Again, that's not a big deal statewide, but obviously in areas that have a lot of seasonal recreational property, that's a fairly big deal for them. In the metro area, then on the next chart, it's a very different picture because agricultural is such a small part of the overall landscape of tax capacity in the metro and seasonal rec as well. So primarily the impact in the metro area is you see that the commercial industrial share drops from 31 to 22%, and the homesteads pick up that difference by going from 51% to 61%. Again, on average in the metro, that's what this change would do. So it's kind of important to realize that the impacts are kind of different on this proposal for the metro versus Greater Minnesota because of that influence of agricultural property or the importance of agricultural property.
All right, and we have a question from Representative Loeffler.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Hines, looking at the last table on this handout, it looks like the biggest change, though, is for the small businesses and commercial industrial, in that they're under 150,000, and they would go from 100% to 125%, if I'm reading your chart right. And, you know, I don't think in the metro there's many small businesses under 150,000. Is it possible to, am I interpreting that right? I think they're buried in the pie charts, so you don't really see the difference of big businesses, skyscrapers, huge manufacturing plants, versus the small businesses on main streets, whether they're in small towns or they're in the city.
Mr. Haynes?
Madam Chair, Representative Loeffler, the commercial industrial property up, the first tier, the up to 150, is the fourth line on that chart. And it's going from, right now, basically 150% would drop to 100%. So it actually is better off under this, would pay a smaller percentage of a debt levy than it does now.
Thank you.
Representative Loeffler.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I wasn't following the lines across quite as easily. I need a ruler, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Dabney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Hines, I see the significant shift onto homeowners for both the metro area and greater Minnesota. Looking at the metro area tax base comparison, other residential remain stable. Is that another way of saying apartments?
Mr. Haynes.
Mr. Chair, Representative Dabney, that's apartments and then also the class that we call residential non-homestead. So
Okay.
we think of it as rental homes, duplexes, and triplexes. Apartment referring to 4 or more units, and other under 3 is called non-residential, or
All right.
homestead, non-homestead residential.
All right, thank you.
Other questions? All right. Further, do you have more yet, Mr. Hines?
Well, Madam Chair, I was going to say, the next thing I was going to talk about was this longer spreadsheet, and it really is a lot about House File 2495. So I wonder if it makes sense to officially begin the discussion of that bill rather than me starting to go through this spreadsheet now. And I don't know if you'd want us to walk through the summary, or if the authors would like to, or...
Okay. Okay, so Representative Drazkowski suggested that if you want to walk through the summary, and then he and Representative Marquardt will do sort of a presentation of the bill. So if you want to walk us through just kind of the basics, I think that would be helpful. Mr. Strom.
Madam Chair, members, the bill summary in your packet is to the delete all amendment to House File 2495. There aren't many differences between 2495 as introduced and the delete everything amendment, except that it recognizes the passage last year, the enactment of the school building bond ag credit. There's a rather lengthy, about a page worth of overview on what's happening, and let me just talk about it real quickly here from a big picture, and then we'll talk about the specific sections. So as some of the conversation has reflected, there's about 3 moving parts here. One of those is a tax base, and so the definition of tax base for the debt service levy is changing as the discussion of the charts that Mr. Hines just talked about and Representative Dabney's comments show. The relative shares, those are proportions, the relative shares of how that tax is falling is going to change as that tax base changes. But then the second part that happens is, of course, there's equalization. And under the bill that we're going to talk about in a moment, that equalization can lower the overall share of levy before it even gets to that point of being spread on taxpayers. So there'll be some effect about that that as well. And then the third thing to mention is that anytime there's sort of major changes in the system, there may be behavioral changes as a response to that. It may be easier or more difficult to pass a referendum, and those are very hard things for us to guess, and when we get into the long printout, we'll explain the methodology we use to get there. So with these shifting things, what the bill essentially does is it changes the debt service levy from one calculated on tax capacity to one calculated on the new referendum market value. There's a group of very small school districts that are primarily all ag land currently, that changing of the tax base definition, removing the ag property from the revised referendum market value, leaves them essentially at a position where they're unable to really afford a school building that they may not be able to pass the referendum for anyway right now. And so the first 4 sections of the bill take a grant program and create a grant program for school districts that are geographically isolated, that have less than 500 kids per grade, and have a tax base that's more than 50% agricultural. And the reason for that is if the district's ag enough, if you're removing all the ag land value from the tax base, that there's just not much tax base left in those communities. Then moving on, what's essentially changing is the debt service equalization formula is changing, and for those bond issues that have been approved up through July 1st, 2021, up till then, those are all going to continue to be equalized on the current net tax capacity tax base with the ag credit applied to them. For bond issues that are approved after that point in time, they're going to be equalized based on the referendum market value tax base, and the aid levy shares will be determined through that equalization, and then the levy share will be spread on that revised referendum market value as well. So the next several sections of the bill deal with that equalization and essentially replace our current equalization formula with a new formula with a new tax base, so that there's a higher level of equalization but on a different tax base, and the relative property values of districts will change compared to what they are now because of that different tax base. So sections 6 through about 13, I guess it is, are adjusting those revised referendum market value debt service calculations to split the debt service levy into the 2 categories and perform the equalization from there on out. Then section 14 has to do with how those tax levies are spread, and again, the debt service levy that existed prior to July 1st, 2021 stays on NTC until those bonds are finally repaid, which could be up to 20 years out from that point in time. The new debt service bond, the new bonds approved after that point in time go on this new tax base. Then in section 15, Mr. Hines may want to talk about that, reiterate sort of what the changes are in this new revised referendum market value that the debt service levy is going to go against.
Mr. Hines?
Yes, just to review what was in the chart, there's 2 major changes to the definition of referendum market value, and the first is that the commercial industrial property over 150,000, so the upper tier CI, which currently pays at 100% of its market value, now it's 125%. So they pay a higher percentage of the referendum market value levy, CI, second tier TI, and then non-commercial seasonal recreational, i.e. cabins, pay, currently they don't pay anything to the referendum market value tax, and now they would pay that at a 25% of their value rate. So those are the two changes there.
And Mr. Hines, do you know how many of the CI properties in the metro area would be valued at over $150,000 as a percentage?
Madam Chair, I don't know that, but I would imagine it would be a very high percentage.
Most of them, probably. Okay.
And I might be able to find that out, but
Thank you.
I'm sure.
Thank you. Representative Uwaki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hines, I was just going back to what you said. I heard the 50% ag land for the small isolated schools. Was it 500 students per grade level or per school?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Strom.
Representative Joaquin, per school. So per district. So the whole unit would be 500 or less.
Yes. And then,
Oh, and actually, Representative New was on the list for a question. Representative New? No? Okay. I'm sorry. I interrupted you. Go
Madam Chair,
ahead.
then there's the last section, Bill Section 16, which we haven't really mentioned at all yet, also provides that city and county referendum levies for bonded debt would be levied against this new tax base. So we've only talked about it in terms of schools, and by there's certainly a much larger share of these bonded debt projects that are approved by the voters. But to keep things parallel, the bill requires that any city and county projects that involve referendums for bonded debt would also go against the same tax base, the referendum market value. Most cities and counties generally do not have to go to voters to get approval, but there are circumstances where they do, or where a referendum is brought forward that does approve these, so that would affect them to some degree as well.
All right. Mr. Strom, did you have something more to add?
No, I think I would reiterate that last point, that that's one of the big differences between other municipalities and school districts, is that almost all of the school district debt service levies are done after the voters have approved a bond sale, whereas with the cities and counties, for most of their building projects, there's not a referendum for those. So we're sort of talking about sort of the flip side of the coin here, that on the school projects, most of those are, the vast majority are voter approved. And on the city side, they're generally not voter approved.
Mr.
One, Madam Chair, if I could just intervene, and I don't know if Representative Drazkowski, were you going to talk about this chart?
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hines, go ahead.
There's another one of the chart, a bar chart in your handout. At the top of it says total aid and credit payments under House File 2495. Is just a very overall schematic drawing that, or attempt to show you what's happening with the bill, and the dark parts of the bar show the current sort of credit and equalization plans in place, or programs in place. So the $40 million credit, 40% credit approved last year, plus the debt equalization program of only $20 million that's been in existence now. You see that that's declining over time, as after starting with 2022, as those bonds are paid off. And then the lighter gray part shows then the debt equalization payments that come through the new equalization program for those. And it's just the numbers are just show a straight line, straight lines going up and down for the two. We don't really know how they would go, because as Mr. Strom indicated, it's also based on what voters would actually approve, and it's hard to say. But that's the idea, that over time the old programs go away and the new program becomes dominant and paramount. And then the next thing would be the printout, which really gets at how the program works. And I don't know, Representative Drazkowski, do you want me to hit that, or do you want to
Representative
go
Drazkowski.
next?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I wonder if maybe Representative Markwart and I could talk about, kind of introduce the bill, and Mr. Hines, we could then go through the printout, and I think Mr. Strom wants to talk about referendum results on his sheet too after that. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I think that would be good. I want to make sure that we get time for you and Representative Markwart to present your concept to the committee. And like I said, we've got about a half an hour left. So why don't we, at this point, have the two of you move forward, and then Representative Dabney, if you have a question, go
I
ahead.
have a question for Mr. Hines, if I may.
Okay, Mr. Hines?
Mr. Hines, I'm at the 35,000-foot level because the details are still too confusing. And if I need to hold this question to next week in front of the full tax committee, when we'll be looking at the new federal tax bill that passed and its implications. But am I understanding right that the redefinition of referendum market value here means a shift of referendum burden onto homeowners, cabins, and small businesses, And the cabins and the homeowners would be limited on their ability to deduct those expenses from their federal taxes because of the limitations on salt under the new tax bill, while the farms, of course, being businesses, and the small businesses would be able to still deduct their property taxes as business expense?
Mr. Hines.
Mr. Chairman, members of Davnie, I give you a very qualified yes on that presumably homeowners will be deducting less of their taxes because of the limit and because of the higher standard deduction that will de facto cause them to not need to or it not be beneficial to deduct anymore. But I think next week you'll get a much more fuller presentation of that.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hines. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Interactions.
Thank you. All right, so Mr. Hines and Mr. Strom, I think it's good if you want to stick close, and we'll come back to questions. And welcome Representative Drazkowski and Representative Marquardt. And whoever wants to kick it off, we welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Loon, and thank you, members, for indulging us in this discussion today. As we mentioned earlier, Representative Marquardt and I have been working on this over the past year and a half or so, and what we really see this is a bill that starts to bring school property tax fairness to farm families across Minnesota. And what we have seen over the past, and we talked about it some with the ag bond credit that passed last session, is that farmers, because of the large amount of farmland that they're required to own and that they own, are paying 10 times, or we're paying 10 times as much as the people in town were for these school construction levies. Now, we took some state money, if you'll remember last session, and I think that Mr. Hines will maybe tell us what the numbers were, and actually, about 40 million. I think it's about 40 million or so, and paid down 40% then of the farmer's portion. So farmers are paying somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 times as much now going forward as of this year as the people in town. And so what we want to do with this bill is bring property tax fairness for those school construction levies. And so what it does is it does this. It brings the farmer's school construction levy amount down significantly, and the people in town, theirs will go up some slightly. And some of us will maintain that for these referendums in the past, many of the people in town haven't been paying for the share that they're voting for, and they're actually voting for referendums that get to be paid by the farmers who are paying 10 times as much. And this has caused, in our rural communities across Minnesota, a great deal of conflict, and also provided for school finance officials the frustration at times with getting very necessary bond items passed, simply because, not that farmers don't support schools, they definitely do, overwhelmingly, but they're in a position they just can't afford what, in many of these cases, what's getting put in front of them. So what this is an effort for us to look at and I'll let Representative Marquardt talk too, but we want to take the 40% ag credit that was passed last session as step one, and then as you look at this bar chart that Mr. Hines put forward, we take that same money and let me back up. This bill, and I think a very clear and important part of this bill is that it doesn't do anything to existing construction referendums, bond referendum, what do they call them?
Debt service.
Bond debt service. I mean, we got education people in here. It doesn't do anything to existing debt service levies that have been already passed in school districts across Minnesota. Those levies will continue in the future to be charged against the same properties they're charged on today at the same percentages. That won't change at all, and they will be paid off until they expire. Now, when they expire, so if you've got next year, say Dilworth School District, say they've got a construction levy and it expires next year, the ag bond credit money that we passed last session then will be freed up from that Dilworth construction project and go into this new referendum market value credit, revised credit, or whatever it was called, and that will help contribute then to this credit that will be used here going forward. And so as they expire, the ag bond money that we're sending to the school districts will instead become part of the school construction credit going forward. So that's part of the dynamics that are at play here. So we see this as step 2 to getting to that fairness between the people on the farm and the people in town, realizing that farms only grow as many people as the people in town do. They grow a lot of crops out there, but they don't grow disproportionately more kids on the farm than they do in town. And so when you look at the costs of that, you want it to be equal, because the burdens are equal coming from the farm families as they are from the people in town. I think most of us in ag communities will acknowledge and truly understand that when it comes to roads and some of that infrastructure, farmers consume a lot more, and so it makes sense in many of those situations for them to continue to pay disproportionate amounts to maybe people who don't have farms. So with that, I'll turn over to Representative Marquardt, and he can help introduce the bill, and then we'll go from there.
So, well, thank you very much, Madam Chair and members, and I really appreciate and thank Representative Drazkowski for his leadership on this issue, and also the opportunity to be able to work on this issue, because as Representative Drazkowski mentioned, we have an inherently unfair system when it comes to ag land and farmers and who's paying the bill. And I would say not only an inherent unfair system to farmers and owners of ag land, but I think it also creates an education funding inequity among school districts and in allowing students to have a top-notch education opportunity. I really think it impacts that. So why is that? Well, right now, the way the debt service levies work and the equalization, it puts farmers in a very unfair, untenable position. In many of the districts in rural Minnesota, farmland is paying 60, 70, 80, up to 90% of the bill when it comes to these new buildings. And yet they're probably, if you actually take the farmers voting, they're probably 2 to 5% of the vote. And it has created this inequity among school districts. And I've seen it at Dilworth, Glen and Felton, in Barnesville. The last couple of years, they've tried to pass some of these. And it creates division among the communities. And I teach. Many of my former students, I've been there 35 years, are farming. They are very pro-education. But when you look at an economy and commodity prices that are really low, it's very difficult for farmers to say, geez, I just can't do it. I'd love to do it, but I can't do it. And even people in town see that unfairness, and they actually will vote no in many cases. Now, is that the only reason? No. But you look at the data that was provided in one of the handouts, and you can see in the debt service in the rural areas, the percent of passes are much lower than in the metro area. And in fact, the last couple of years have been under 50%. And so, it's almost coming to where you live as to whether or not you can have a top-notch school facility. And regardless of where you live, I think, and Representative Drazkowski, we've talked about this, every student should have the same opportunity to have a top-notch school facility for a world-class economy. And so what this does, I think, is corrects some of this equalization. And, as Mr. Strom and Mr. Hines mentioned, the equalization for debt service is only at about 2.5%, about $22 million of aid out of about $930 million of levy. And I'm not pointing blame. I was chair of this committee for 2 years, and we didn't touch this issue. But back 20 years ago, in 1998, 1999, the percent of aid versus the levy was 10%. It was like 38 million out of about 380 million. And so that has created a big problem there. And the way the system works, as the value of ag land goes up, and many of these rural districts, they're not even staying the same on enrollment, they're going down, it makes these districts look really wealthy when they're not. And so how do they pass them when as they get wealthier, they're getting almost no equalization. The equalization basically has been the ag land. The ag land has allowed otherwise poor school districts to pass bond referendums. Now, I don't have a problem with that, except the state should be doing the equalization, not agricultural land. And that's what's happening, is they're banking on agricultural land to do this. And that, it just can't be that way. So what this does is, I think, creates a much fairer system. And if you look at this sheet right here, you'll notice how the percent, the shift, but it gets to be very close in both the metro and the rural areas. And I think there's where there's some inequity, because you're placing so much on so few in the rural area that it is hurting rural school districts the ability to provide top-notch educational facilities. So that's kind of a reason, or some of the additional reasons. But we spent about 2 years on this, and one thing that I don't think was brought up, because you don't have that sheet in there, but with the bill of Representative Drazkowski's, the operating referendums now would actually move a little bit of the distribution away from homes, because where everything used to be 100% on referendum, you now have businesses at 125% and seasonal rec at 25%. So it actually, on operating referendums, would actually move a little bit the other way versus the way it's moved on the debt service. And we don't see that here, but so appreciate, I know this is something for discussion and so forth, and certainly welcome that, but I think it's a much fairer approach and will create more equity in school funding and student opportunity.
All right, thank you. We've got a couple of questions. Representative Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got a couple of questions. First of all, what was the reasoning to reduce the cabin debt service from 100% to 25%?
Representative Drazkowski?
Hey, Representative Marquardt, you remember that
Yeah,
discussion?
I do. Well, part of that is right now on operating referendums, seasonal rec is 0, just like the ag land
Right.
is 0. And it's 100 or 125% on debt service. So it was kind of a compromise there. And in all truthfulness, as Representative Drazkowski and I were doing various scenarios, we were changing some of those numbers to try to get kind of a balance. And certainly balance and fairness is to the eye of the beholder. But so on debt service, seasonal rec will see less of a burden, and on the operating referendums, more of a burden than under current law.
Representative Peterson?
Madam Chair.
And Madam Chair, if I could,
Representative Drazkowski?
thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Peterson, and the same thing happens with business. So they will go, businesses will pay more under the operating referendum under this proposal, but less under construction referendums. And so that was part of the balance Representative Marquardt was talking about. But, if we can still tweak this to get it, even better, we certainly will. But the advantage of this, too, and it wasn't talked about, is that we will have one tax base going forward for both construction and operating referendums. It will create more simplicity in school districts going forward. In the long term, you'll be dealing with the same tax base going forward instead of 2 different tax bases like we have now.
Representative Peterson?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And the other question is if cities are now going to follow the same formula, and you brought up roads, and I'm like, it's one thing about students, but now we're talking into other projects that cities might be doing. I mean, have you looked at more of the impact of what that would mean?
Representative Drazkowski?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Representative Peterson, we haven't looked at it a lot. We've heard cities and counties say we're kind of concerned about this, but in talking with staff here, we understand it's, as mentioned earlier, a small amount of the financing for cities and counties. And if I think we as Minnesota can get through this little blip for them, that will become the norm going forward, and it probably will just be an adjustment period. That's my sense, but certainly we'll have discussion. Some of them may have some opposition to that part of the bill because it's a change, and this is a big change that we're proposing, and in order to do it, there's going to be a little bit of bumps to get there, and we're hopeful that's one that we can weather.
Representative Hertaus?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Markwart and Representative Drazkowski. Thanks for trying to tackle a really difficult problem that always exists with our property tax system and the complexities of it. And as the market changes and we go through economic downturns and recessions, unfortunately, that loss of value of homesteads and the inability to even secure mortgage financing drove home values down, while at that same time, ag prices were fairly good in those years, and that was kind of the shining star of the economy for a while. So ultimately, we see the consequences of that. But my point is maybe just a little bit follow-up to Representative Peterson's question about recreational property. Many cabins are generational and have been in families for a long time. And it's probably true with commercial property that there are some non-resident commercial property owners who don't get to vote in the district, but I would say at least in greater Minnesota, they're largely resident owners and do get to vote on these things, but, and there may be exception with cabins, but I think for the most part, seasonal recreational property has no say in this and doesn't get to vote on these things, unlike a farm in the district or a business in the district. So I'm a little concerned about some of the progress that we've made with regard to the state general levy, and now this effect taking place again on seasonal recreational property. So that's something that I would share some concern over. They don't get to vote.
Did you want to comment on that, Representative Drazkowski?
Madam Chair, I'll just add, and Representative Hertaus, I think we all know and have heard too, even in school construction referendums, that farms that maybe own 40 in the neighboring school district don't get to vote on that. And some will say, is there a constitutional issue with that? You know, taxation without representation. Under this proposal, that goes away. And so, you know, it's going to help in some of those areas. Again, with seasonal rec in the bill, at least the way we have it, they will pay a little more on operating referendums, a little more than zero, what they're paying now, but less on the construction referendums going forward with the bill.
Representative Hertaus.
Thank you, Representative Drazkowski. And my follow-up to that is kind of like the point you made, no representation, taxation. Most people that own seasonal recreational properties don't have kids in those school districts, so they're paying for something they're not getting. And I guess we can always argue that an educated society benefits everybody, whether you live there or not, and I agree with that principle. But yeah, I'm struggling a little bit with the inability to vote on seasonal recreational property.
Representative Loeffler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I had some questions, just trying to find out what our current status is and what it really will impact people. And if you look at the chart that we got from our staff that says school building bond ag credit estimated pay 18 amount and effect on example properties, and I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly because it doesn't seem to reflect some of what I've heard, and that is if you just look on the very top lines where it says statewide, metro districts, non-metro districts, and we just look at non-metro districts, because that's what we're talking about, even though this would affect taxpayers in every part of the state. You have an example of a $200,000 home and a $1.8 million farm. That wouldn't include the 1 acre, the home, the garage. And without the credit that we passed into law last year, they would be, it would be $1,087,000 or $1 billion. I'm not quite sure what the measure is here on this one. 1,087 anyhow. For the farm, the $1.8 million farm versus $242 as the debt levy on the $200,000 home. And so while there's a 9 times difference in value, the difference is 4 times in terms of the tax burden. But then when you, in the next column, apply the credit that we just passed into law, which gives a 40% break to address the issue we're talking about today, it goes down to $652 on the farm and $242 on that $200,000 home. And so it's really 2.5 times the burden, the business that's 9 times more valuable versus the $200,000, at least in my area, that's a modest home, difference. And so I'm wondering if I'm interpreting these tables correctly, that the difference right now is about 2.5 times between that sample farmland versus the homeowner. And since ag property has been going down the last few years, whether or not we need to kind of catch up some of our assumptions, because I'll just be honest, I don't represent an ag area, and I am sympathetic to the issues that the school districts face in the ag area that I've heard about. At the same time, the proposal before us shifts tax burdens dramatically on different types of property owners all throughout the state. And that's not a small undertaking. And so I think we really need to understand, you know, how big is the problem and what new problems will we be creating for homeowners and business owners. You know, most people, even in rural areas, a majority of people are still, you know, have someone in the household who's working for another business. Is my understanding. And in many places you have to. And to get benefits, health insurance, to use the skills of the other adult in the household, whatever. And so am I misinterpreting these examples? Because I really do want to understand.
Yeah.
Representative Markwart.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Loeffler. You're correct in the effective rate for agricultural land is less than residential land. That's exactly right. But I think what you're missing here is that we're talking about districts where the value of the ag land, where it's falling off on one area, is 60, 70, 80, 90%. And you don't have the people out there anymore. And if this wasn't creating a problem, then maybe we wouldn't be here. But not only is it unfair to the farmers just by looking at voting versus the amount of what they're paying, but it actually is having an impact on the quality of education in rural Minnesota. And, you know, you look at the statistics on what's passing and what's failing, it's a much lower rate in rural Minnesota. And I think because, as I said earlier, I think students are seeing an inequity in student learning opportunities. And I think by correcting this on the debt service would go a long ways in not only making a fair system for farmers, but also a better situation for education throughout the state and in rural Minnesota. I think it's a larger picture there than just looking at some numbers here.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Chair Loon. And Representative Loeffler, I think maybe Mr. Hines can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you look at those last two columns where you were, if you're a farm family, you need to add those two together, because your home in this chart, if I don't know if Mr. Hines can nod or shake his head, the $242 is also paid by the house, garage, and acre on the farm. The $652 is only the farmland. So if you're a farmer, you're paying, you know, you're paying both of those currently. But I would also add, Madam Chair, if I could, that just to make it clear, and I've heard the 5-letter word shift a couple of times, but this isn't shifting anything that's being done now. What's being paid for now is going to continue under the proposal to be paid for in the future the same way it is today until those bonds are paid off. What we're talking about is changing the rules somewhere down the road, and we're open to adjustments on dates, et cetera, and we've put it down the road a couple of years to give school districts the ability to figure out, well, if we're going to do a construction project, do we want to do it under the new rules or under the current rules, or do we want to wait 2 years or 3 years or whatever and do it under the new rules? What would benefit us more and make most sense for our voters and our schools? So the bill recreates the rules under which everybody in a school district in a future bond referendum would decide whether or not they're going to vote for it or not. And that's what would lock in their tax liability. There's no shifts in tax liability. They will vote for a tax liability for themselves in the future. It's the voters initiating that, and we're changing the rules or the structure under which they would do that in the bill. That's what we do.
Okay. I got 2 members on the list. Let me just proceed with my thought. Representative Loeffler, I'll come back to you. So
I just wanted to react to what they said.
And I'll give you that chance. So 2 members on the list, and then I do want Mr. Hines to explain one other chart that's in here before we wrap. So I'm just going to ask members to be brief. We'll try to stick as close to noon as we can. Representative Loeffler.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll be brief. But, I mean, that's why I raised the question. I personally would prefer a more targeted approach that really targets ag-related school districts only and doesn't shift the tax base of the entire state in these obligations. Everybody struggles and works really hard to pass school referendums, no matter where you are, and they're always iffy. And to shift more of it onto homeowners and to other types of properties will be a challenge for many of us who don't represent ag areas and can't explain why we have shifted the burdens of education within our communities. And so I think we just need to keep looking creatively at ways that we can better refine and target the problem is my general sense.
All right, thank you. Representative Whalen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to be brief, and if it takes longer explanation, I can maybe talk with you offline. First, I want to commend you both. Thank you for doing this. I think it's a great bill overall, my understanding of it at any rate. And I'm looking at the Department of Revenue statement here. I don't know if someone from the department is here, but under the measures that they use, the property tax benchmarks, transparency, understandability, simplicity, and accountability, it's increasing and decreasing. However, Representative Drazkowski, you made very clear that my understanding is creating, we're not creating 2 different tax bases, but it says that we are on this. Can you help me understand?
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Representative Whalen, what I understand that to mean is, I think this chart might help you, this one might help you kind of a little bit, but we're moving it to 1 new tax base going forward for all new referendums going forward. But there is this period of time, the department's saying, where we as a department will have to keep track of 2 different ones because these old ones are still expiring over time, and it may take up to 20 years. But after that 20-year period, we'll only have 1.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Representative.
Thank you. All right, so if we could have Mr. Hines come up to explain this other chart that's in your packets, just so we all know what that is. And I'm sorry, it is a very big topic to try to cover in an hour and a half. So I appreciate the members' questions and their interests. And if we have time when session resumes on the 20th to explore this more, we will. So, Mr. Hines.
Madam Chair, the last chart then to be talked about is the one that's another printout style, but it's on the longer paper. On the top of it says tax impacts of hypothetical $20 million bond referendum, et cetera. And I'll just race through this. It's mostly going to be something we're probably going to want to look up your districts or districts you're most familiar with. But what we did to try to look at how does this affect people is we said, let's look at the possibility of each district that might be considering passing a bond referenda at $20 million, which is $1.4 million per year debt service, and what would the tax impact of that be under current law versus under House File 2495? So each district is different because obviously their tax base is different, but also because they have some existing level of debt that may or may not be influencing their ability to get equalization money. So the first 2 columns in the of this, and the groupings in this printout are different than the standard one in that first the greater Minnesota districts are grouped into groups of over 2,000 pupils, then between 1,000 and 2,000, and then under 1,000, just to kind of give you more urban to more rural in the greater Minnesota districts. And then at the very end is the metro districts, grouped by Minneapolis, St. Paul, then the inner suburbs, and then the outer suburbs. So the first two columns show the amount of state aid they would get under current law versus under the proposal. And remember that the total the debt service is 1.4 million. So that is what part, what part of that 1.4 million would be paid by state aid, state equalization aid under this proposal. Then the second two charts are the tax rates that would apply under the newly approved being considered debt. And then finally, the last sets of columns refer to the tax impacts for different types of property. So we have a $125,000 home, a $225,000 home, a farm, a 300-acre farm with $6,000 per acre, a $300,000 business property, and then a $200,000 cabin out at the end. And for each of those property types, we show what the tax impact would be under current law, under this proposal, and then the third column we show is the existing operating. So that reflects what Representative Drazkowski and Marquardt mentioned too, was that the operating levies, operating referendum levies, because they shifted this right away in 2022, that impact would occur whether the district passed a referendum or not. So that's kind of a constant in this, and it wouldn't depend on the size of the referendum either. So they don't exactly parallel, but you need to keep in mind that there is this impact because of the referendum levies, the existing ones. And then on the ag piece, we show one other column, which is we showed the tax burden without the credit and then with the credit. And in this case, when we talk about the farm, it includes the house, garage, and 1 acre in the farm, unlike the previous printout, which we just were looking at the land separately. So again, that's kind of hurried. You'll see that, one thing that came up is like in the cabins, the very right-hand columns, the existing operating, you'll see that's always an increase, and that reflects that they don't pay anything on the operating now. They would all have an increase right off the bat. So even though they'd pay a lot less under current law, under this proposal for a new building, they do have this tax increase that would come from the referendums switching over or being redefined. And then the businesses, somewhat the same effect. They always have an increase because of that 125 change the referendum market value. So I think I'll stop there and take questions, or if Mr. Strom wants to add anything.
Yeah, Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hines, looking at this printout and taking Detroit Lakes as an example, I think Representative Marquardt represents that district. They receive no state aid under current law. They will receive no state aid under this proposal. But then there's Bemidji that currently receives no state aid under current law, who will receive $183,928. So could you comment on why that is for both those? Because they're both highly seasonal areas, and I'm wondering if that has an effect. Could you walk us through that? Because I'm a little confused.
Mr. Hines.
Maybe I shouldn't be, but I am.
Erickson, and I think Mr. Strom may jump in on this too, but in general, you'll see that there's much more aid in the greater Minnesota districts under the new
yes,
under the proposal, and that mostly reflects the fact that they no longer have the tax base of the ag property, and there is an enhanced equalization, so they do tend to get. Most districts will get aid if they were going for a new bond. As far as why Detroit Lakes and Bemidji are different, I'm not sure, but I think in general it's more of an agricultural issue than a seasonal rec issue.
well, certainly with DL, they have farmland, but, thank you, Madam Chair. But Bemidji is not so much farmland. I'm just a little confused.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, we'll break down all the details that go into this, and we'll get back to Representative Erickson about this as to what's different about their two tax bases.
Thank you. In fact, I think most of the committee members would probably, the chair included, needs to look at this and get a little more informed on all of the implications of this proposal. So with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm sorry, I have another commitment, so we've got to end. But I want to thank Representative Drazkowski and Marquardt for bringing forward a very interesting idea. I know you've worked hard on it. We appreciate that. And to our two nonpartisans who have prepared a lot of materials to help us understand what happens currently and what would happen under this proposal. So thank you very much, Mr. Hines, Mr. Strom. And with that, our interim hearing is adjourned. Members, please note that you have a per diem form if you wish to fill that out. Please provide it to our CLA, Ms. Kynes, or to the property tax CLA to turn in. With that, we are adjourned.